It all started with a simple desire to keep my lawn green during the scorching summer. Nothing fancy, just a basic sprinkler system to help the grass survive the relentless sun. I live in a suburban neighborhood where most people are friendly enough, waving as they walk their dogs or sharing a chat over the fence. But every community seems to have that one person. In ours, her name is Karen. She's not just any neighbor, she's the self-appointed ruler of our HOA. With a clipboard in hand and a permanent scowl etched across her face, Karen patrols the streets like a hawk, ready to pounce on any perceived violation of the sacred neighborhood bylaws. At first, I paid her no mind. I figured as long as I kept my property tidy, mowed the lawn, and didn't throw wild parties, I'd stay off her radar. For a while, that was true. But the moment I installed my new sprinkler system, the dynamic changed. It wasn't elaborate or flashy, just a practical setup to keep the grass healthy. Yet within days, Karen began making snide remarks about water conservation and how some neighbors were abusing community resources. I brushed it off, thinking it was just more of her usual grumbling. Then one morning, I noticed something odd. The sprinkler head was missing. At first, I thought it might have been a fluke. Maybe a kid had messed with it or a dog had knocked it loose. I replaced it and moved on. But when it disappeared again and then again, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Whispers from neighbors hinted at the culprit, and my gut told me exactly who it was. That's when I decided, if Karen wanted to play games, I'd play right back, on my own terms. And that's how this story really begins. Karen wasn't just a name in our neighborhood. She was a presence. The kind of person you noticed whether you wanted to or not. Always in the middle of everything, always with an opinion about how things should be done. She lived 2 houses down from me, in a pristine colonial-style home with perfectly trimmed hedges and seasonal wreaths that changed like clockwork. Her driveway was spotless, her garbage bins were aligned like soldiers, and if your recycling wasn't sorted just so, you could be sure she'd report it, usually with a terse email copied to the HOA board. She didn't start out as my personal nemesis. In fact, when I first moved in, she was among the first to introduce herself, clipboard in hand, welcoming me to the community and offering me a printed copy of the HOA guidelines, highlighted and annotated, of course. I smiled politely, thanked her, and tucked the document away in a drawer. I figured she was harmless, just a little overzealous. But over time, I started seeing her true colors. She'd send out mass emails about neighbors parking 1 inch too close to the curb, or leaving Halloween decorations up a day past the allowed period. Once, she even left a handwritten note on a neighbor's door because their porch light bulb had burned out. It wasn't long before Karen's gaze turned to me. The first incident was trivial. I had placed a small flower pot on the shared sidewalk in front of my house. The next morning, it was gone. In its place was another note, this time citing a clause about keeping community pathways clear. I was annoyed but decided not to make a fuss. It wasn't worth the drama, but from that point forward I was on her radar. I began noticing her frequent strolls past my house, sometimes with her dog, sometimes alone. Always slow, eyes scanning every detail. If my grass looked even slightly overgrown, I'd get a gentle reminder. If a package sat on my porch for more than a few hours, another note would appear. It was as if she had made it her personal mission to ensure that every home on the block met her impossibly high standards. And yet, for all her fussing, Karen had her own way of bending the rules when it suited her. I'd seen her park in front of fire hydrants during HOA meetings. I'd heard stories about her borrowing garden tools and forgetting to return them. But no one dared confront her directly. Karen had friends on the board, and more importantly, she had time. A seemingly endless supply of it to wage petty battles and escalate the smallest grievances into neighborhood-wide debates. So when my sprinkler system caught her attention, I wasn't entirely surprised. Annoyed, yes, but not surprised. What I didn't know then was just how far she'd go, or how much satisfaction I'd eventually get from turning the tables on her. Because with Karen, it was never just about a sprinkler, it was about control. And I was about to show her that I wasn't so easily controlled. The idea of installing a sprinkler system had been on my mind for a while. Summers here were brutal, and dragging a hose around the yard was becoming a daily chore I dreaded. I'd spent a few weekends researching options, watching DIY videos and sketching out a simple plan. It wasn't about having the greenest lawn on the block or impressing anyone. I just wanted to keep the grass alive without wasting hours every week. After a couple of trips to the hardware store and a bit of elbow grease, the system was ready. A neat, efficient setup with pop-up heads that covered the yard perfectly. I was proud of the result. Not flashy, just functional. Neighbours noticed the change right away. One complimented how evenly the lawn was watered. Another asked about the brand of sprinkler I'd used. It felt good to have a small project turn out well, but not everyone shared the enthusiasm. Karen had walked by during the installation, slowing her pace as she watched me work. She didn't say anything at first, just observed with that familiar, tight-lipped expression. Later that afternoon, I caught her eyeing the control box, mounted discreetly on the side of the house. A few days later, she made her first comment. I was watering the lawn one evening when she passed by and remarked, "You know, we have community guidelines about water usage. Some people think they're above it all." I smiled, nodded, and kept adjusting the sprinkler head. It wasn't worth engaging. I reviewed the guidelines just to be safe. There were no specific restrictions against automated sprinklers as long as they were used responsibly. My watering schedule complied with local regulations and HOA rules. Confident I was in the clear, I continued using the system without giving her another thought. But Karen, as I would soon learn, wasn't one to let things go so easily. The first real sign of trouble came a week later. I noticed one of the sprinkler heads was missing. At first I thought perhaps it had malfunctioned or been knocked loose somehow. I replaced it and shrugged it off as a fluke. But 2 days later, another head vanished. This time I was more suspicious. I checked for signs of tampering but found nothing definitive. Still, the coincidence nagged at me. Conversations with a couple of neighbours hinted at Karen's increasing disapproval. One mentioned overhearing her complain about wasteful water displays and how certain homeowners were undermining the community's efforts. I started keeping a closer eye on the yard, but with a full-time job, it wasn't always easy. The next incident confirmed my worst suspicion. I returned home late one evening to find yet another sprinkler head gone, and muddy footprints leading toward Karen's side of the street. That was when irritation gave way to determination. I wasn't about to let someone steal from me under the guise of enforcing community standards. If Karen wanted a battle over my sprinkler system, I was more than ready to oblige. The first time it happened, I wanted to believe it was an accident. I'd just finished mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning and decided to run the sprinklers for a cycle while I cleaned up. As the water arced across the grass, I noticed something odd near the far corner of the yard, a sputtering sound where there should have been a smooth spray. I walked over and found one of the sprinkler heads missing. In its place was an exposed stub, jagged where the head had been twisted off. I stood there for a moment, puzzled. Sprinkler heads don't just vanish. Maybe it had broken loose, or maybe someone's dog had tugged at it. I scoured the area for any sign of it, but came up empty. Annoyed but not alarmed, I made a quick run to the hardware store for a replacement. By that afternoon, everything was back in order. The next morning, while chatting with my neighbour Dave over the fence, I mentioned the odd disappearance. He gave me a knowing look. "You might want to keep an eye on that," he said. "Karen's been on a warpath about water usage lately. Heard her complaining at the last HOA meeting." I chuckled, unsure whether to take him seriously. Stealing a sprinkler head seemed petty, even for Karen. A few days passed without incident. I convinced myself it had just been a fluke. Then, on Thursday evening, I came home from work and immediately noticed something was off. The lawn on the same side looked dry, with a small puddle near the sprinkler line. Dread settled in my stomach. I rushed over, and sure enough, the replacement head was gone, again. This time there were faint, muddy scuffs on the sidewalk nearby, too large to be from an animal. Now the pattern was undeniable. Someone was taking my sprinkler heads, and it wasn't some random act of mischief. The prime suspect wasn't hard to identify. Karen had already made her disapproval crystal clear, and her reputation for petty acts of enforcement was well known. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. If I confronted her without proof, she'd deny everything and probably twist the situation to make me look like the problem. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I talked to a couple more neighbours. One, an older woman named Mrs. Green, said she'd seen Karen loitering near my yard that week, pausing several times to peer at the sprinklers. Another neighbour, Rick, mentioned he'd overheard Karen telling someone on her front porch that some people need to be taught a lesson about waste. The picture was becoming clearer. That weekend, I installed a small motion-activated camera facing the sprinkler line. It wasn't an expensive system, just a simple setup to catch any late-night tampering. I adjusted the angle, tested it, and waited. The following Monday, I came home to another missing sprinkler head, but this time I had footage. The video wasn't perfect. Low light and some distance, but it showed enough. Around 5:30 in the morning, Karen could be seen walking her dog. She paused by my lawn, looked around and crouched down. A few seconds later, she stood up and walked away, pocketing something in her jacket. My heart raced with a mix of anger and vindication. There it was, proof. Now the question was what to do next. March over and confront her, file a report with the HOA. Neither option seemed satisfying. I wanted her to stop, but more than that, I wanted her to understand that actions had consequences. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a devious little plan began to take shape. If Karen wanted to mess with my sprinklers, she was about to get far more than she bargained for. After capturing that first bit of footage, I thought briefly about sending it to the HOA. It was clear evidence after all, but then I remembered how toothless the board was when it came to Karen. She practically ran the place through a mix of persistence and intimidation. Any complaint I filed would likely get buried under vague statements about neighborly relations and insufficient proof. I needed to be smarter than that. So I saved the footage on a backup drive and quietly replaced the stolen sprinkler head once again. The following week, I adjusted my camera setup for a clearer angle and added a second one disguised in a garden ornament. I also decided to vary the watering schedule, hoping to catch Karen off guard. Sure enough, my precautions paid off. Early Thursday morning, another alert came through. This time, the footage was crystal clear. Karen, dressed in her usual walking outfit with her little terrier in tow, stopped at the same spot. She knelt, twisted off the sprinkler head, and tucked it away before casually strolling off as if nothing had happened. Watching it unfold made my blood boil, but I also felt a grim satisfaction. There was no denying it now. I shared the new footage discreetly with a few trusted neighbors. Their reactions were a mix of outrage and amusement. Everyone had their own Karen story, it seemed. One neighbor mentioned a potted plant that mysteriously vanished from their porch. Another recalled receiving a formal HOA warning about leaving their garage door open for more than 15 minutes. Karen's reign of petty tyranny extended far beyond my yard. Still, the sprinkler thefts continued. Over the next 2 weeks, I replaced 3 more heads. Each time, Karen struck in the early hours, just before sunrise. I was impressed in a way by her dedication, but I was also running out of patience. Replacing parts wasn't cheap, and the principle of it all gnawed at me. This was my property, my home. I had every right to water my lawn within the rules. Karen had no right to interfere. I briefly considered confronting her in person. I imagined walking up to her with the footage playing on my phone, demanding an explanation. But then I remembered her talent for denial. She'd claim it was doctored or that I was harassing her. Worse, she might escalate the situation and start filing complaints against me. No, a direct confrontation wouldn't work. I needed a way to make her stop without giving her any ammunition. That's when I stumbled across a gardening forum thread about prank deterrence. Among the usual suggestions, fake cameras, warning signs, even motion-activated sprinklers, one comment caught my eye. A user had filled their irrigation line with a harmless but brightly colored vinegar-based solution. When the thief tampered with it, they ended up soaked and stained. The idea was brilliant. It wouldn't cause any damage, but it would send a very clear message. The more I thought about it, the more I liked it. I could already picture Karen's horrified reaction, drenched in dyed vinegar with no one to blame but herself. It was poetic justice, but if I was going to pull this off, I needed to do it carefully. No one could suspect I'd set a trap. I began planning every detail, from the dye mixture to the timing of the watering cycle. Karen had made this personal, and now it was my turn to even the score. The idea of using vinegar and dye stuck with me the entire evening after I read about it online. At first, I questioned whether I really wanted to stoop to Karen's level, But as I replayed the footage of her shamelessly pocketing yet another sprinkler head, my resolve hardened. This wasn't about petty revenge anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had been getting away with this kind of behavior for far too long, and if a harmless splash of vinegar and dye would make her think twice, so be it. I spent the next couple of nights researching the safest way to pull it off. I wanted a mixture that wouldn't damage my sprinkler system, harm the lawn, or pose any real risk to Karen or her dog. Vinegar was perfect. It would evaporate quickly, and its strong smell would add to the deterrent factor. For the color, I opted for a concentrated food-grade dye, bright pink, impossible to ignore but non-toxic and safe for skin contact. I ran a few tests with an old sprinkler head in the backyard. The mixture sprayed beautifully, leaving a vivid splash of color that lingered on fabric but washed out with soap and water. Just the kind of harmless mark that would make a public spectacle of her antics. Timing was crucial. Karen had established a pattern. She struck early in the morning just before sunrise, when the neighborhood was quiet. I set my alarm for 4:30 a.m. and prepared the sprinkler line under the cover of darkness. With gloves on, I disconnected the section closest to where she always struck and carefully poured in my vinegar and dye solution. I then reattached everything, primed the system, and set the control box to trigger the sprinklers manually rather than on their usual timer. This way, I'd be ready the moment Karen showed up. To ensure I wouldn't miss the moment, I connected my motion-activated camera feed to an app on my phone. It would send an alert the instant it detected movement. I tested everything twice to be sure it worked as planned. By the time I was finished, the sky was beginning to lighten. I barely slept that night, adrenaline keeping me wired. The next morning I woke before dawn and positioned myself discreetly in the living room, phone in hand. Sure enough, just after 5:30, the motion alert chimed softly. Heart pounding, I pulled up the live feed. There she was, Karen, dressed in her usual walking attire, dog leash in one hand, and that same smug expression on her face. She paused at the usual spot, glanced around and crouched down. This was it. I tapped the manual trigger on my sprinkler app. With a faint hiss, the system came to life. A powerful jet of pink-tinged vinegar water burst forth, catching Karen full in the chest and face. She stumbled back in shock, sputtering and shrieking as the liquid soaked her clothes. The dog yelped and pulled at the leash as Karen frantically tried to wipe her face and regain her composure. I couldn't hear her words from inside, but her furious gesturing and the deep red hue spreading across her white jogging top spoke volumes. With a final glare toward my house, she stormed off down the street, trailing a bright pink path behind her. I leaned back, heart still racing, a slow grin spreading across my face. The message had been delivered. Now I waited to see what would happen next. Watching Karen stumble away, drenched in pink, was more satisfying than I had ever imagined. I sat back on the couch, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. For weeks, she had waged this petty little war, certain no one would stand up to her. But now, the tables had turned. I replayed the camera footage several times, chuckling at every frame. The way she had crouched down so confidently, the instant switch from smug to horrified when the spray hit her, and the sheer disbelief in her flailing reaction, all of it was pure gold. Later that morning, I went about my day as usual, trying to act as though nothing had happened. Word travels fast in our neighborhood, though, and it wasn't long before a few neighbors dropped by, feigning casual conversation. Mrs. Green was the first. "Did you hear about Karen's little mishap this morning?" she asked, barely able to suppress a smile. I shrugged innocently, though my eyes betrayed my amusement. "Oh? No, I must have missed it." She leaned in conspiratorially. "I heard she came home soaked in something pink. Made quite the scene." Throughout the day, the story spread. Rick told me he'd seen Karen arguing with one of the HOA board members, her stained clothes still visible under her jacket. Apparently she was demanding immediate action, though it was unclear what she expected them to do. After all, I hadn't broken any rules. My sprinkler had simply operated as designed, and if someone happened to be tampering with it, well, that was hardly my fault. By the following morning, Karen had become the talk of the block. Neighbors were openly chuckling about the incident, though most were careful not to do so in front of her. Her usual morning patrols ceased abruptly. The once frequent emails about HOA violations went silent. It seemed my message had landed exactly as intended. Of course, I wasn't entirely in the clear. There was always the chance Karen would try to retaliate or file some kind of complaint, but I had documented everything meticulously. The footage clearly showed her trespassing and tampering with private property. The sprinkler system, the dye, even the choice of safe materials, all carefully chosen to ensure I was within my rights. If she pushed the issue, I was prepared. Over the next week, I kept a watchful eye on both my yard and the neighborhood grapevine. Karen remained uncharacteristically subdued, avoiding eye contact and keeping her walks brief. I noticed her garden gloves were suddenly a bright pink hue, a stubborn reminder of her ill-fated attempt at theft. My sprinkler system, meanwhile, remained untouched. Not a single head went missing. The message had been loud and clear. Neighbors began to treat me with a newfound camaraderie. Several quietly thanked me for standing up to her, though they all understood the unspoken rule: don't poke the bear unless you're ready to handle the consequences. I smiled and accepted their gratitude, content to let the matter rest. Privately, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I hadn't wanted this fight, but once it started, I wasn't about to back down. In a small way, I'd restored a bit of balance to our community. Karen's days of unchecked meddling were over, at least for now. As for my sprinklers, they kept on watering the lawn in peace, their bright pink line long since flushed out, but their purpose perfectly served. And I couldn't help but think, sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them paint themselves into a corner, quite literally. In the days that followed, the mood around the neighborhood noticeably shifted. Karen, once the self-appointed enforcer of our community standards, had retreated into a kind of embarrassed silence. Her usual morning walks were sporadic, and when she did appear, it was with an anxious glance over her shoulder, as if expecting another surprise attack from some unseen sprinkler. The air of untouchability she once carried seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a more subdued presence. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter. Word of the incident spread quickly, though no one openly spoke of it when Karen was around. I overheard snippets of conversation while walking to the mailbox or tending to my front yard. People were laughing about the pink-stained jacket, about her dramatic dash down the street, about how poetic it all was. More than one neighbor came by with a grin, patting me on the shoulder or giving a subtle thumbs up. It felt good to know I wasn't alone in my frustration, that others had been quietly cheering me on. Even the HOA board seemed to take a hands-off approach. Whether they'd seen the footage or simply sensed that this was a battle they didn't want to wade into, no official complaint ever arrived at my door. It was as if an unspoken agreement had been reached. Karen had crossed a line, and what happened was a consequence she'd have to live with. For once, the board's inaction worked in my favor. Karen, of course, wasn't content to let it go entirely. She attempted to rally a few allies on the board to push for new watering system guidelines, but the effort fizzled quickly. Too many people had heard about her trespassing, and no one wanted to be associated with that particular mess. Over time, her influence waned. The constant stream of HOA warnings and nitpicky emails slowed to a trickle. For me, the greatest victory wasn't just in reclaiming my sprinkler system. It was in seeing the neighborhood reclaim a sense of community. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started chatting more openly. There was a shared sense of amusement and quiet solidarity. We'd all dealt with Karen's antics in our own ways, but now it felt like a small wall had come down. The experience, oddly enough, had brought us closer. My lawn remained green, my sprinklers intact. Every time I heard them click on in the early morning, I smiled a little to myself. The battle had been fought, the point made. And Karen? Well, she had become a bit of a ghost in her own domain, her authority shaken by one well-timed blast of pink vinegar. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom or a formal complaint. Sometimes it comes from a clever plan and a little courage to see it through. As far as I was concerned, the matter was settled. And in the quiet hum of the sprinklers, I heard the sound of sweet, satisfying peace. Looking back on the whole ordeal, I sometimes marvel at how a simple sprinkler system became the spark for such a ridiculous neighborhood drama. It wasn't about water or grass or HOA bylaws. It was about boundaries, respect, and standing up to someone who had long believed herself above consequence. Karen had gotten used to intimidating others with her position and persistence, But even the most stubborn bullies can be undone by their own arrogance. All it took was one unexpected splash of pink to remind her of that. In a strange way, I'm grateful for the experience. It taught me that you don't always have to confront a bully head-on to make your point. Sometimes creativity and patience can be even more effective. I could have shouted at Karen or filed endless complaints, but neither would have brought the same result. Letting her walk right into her own embarrassment sent a message louder than any argument ever could. The best part wasn't the personal satisfaction, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't sweet. The true reward was seeing our neighborhood shift, however subtly, in the aftermath. People smiled more, talked more, connected over a shared story that lightened the mood. The invisible walls Karen had built with her constant policing cracked a little that day, and the community was better for it. My sprinklers still hum away each morning, their job unchanged. But every now and then, when I glance out the window and see Karen give my yard a wide berth, I'm reminded that sometimes the best lessons aren't taught through lectures or rules. They're felt in moments that linger long after the water has dried, and this was one lesson I knew she'd never forget.